Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana and May, and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
So on today's episode, one of the things we definitely want to discuss is one of the most common questions we get, which is actually, how do I price my art? Dun, dun, dun. And part of the conundrum with it is, on the one hand, you don't want your art to be overpriced, but you also don't want to be the quote unquote cheap artist, right? We've all seen one, maybe, probably. And on today's episode, part of what we wanted to,
You were doing too good.
Well, I said on today's episode, and then it was later. Bah!
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay. Okay. So one of the most common one of the questions we get the most is, how do I price my art? So on the one hand, you don't want your art to be overpriced, but you also don't want to be that quote unquote cheap artist or be perceived as a cheap artist. So on today's episode, we want to discuss perceived value in art and also ways to evaluate and adjust your pricing if needed. The first thing we want to do is dive into the numbers themselves and also put into perspective what stage you're in. So the first thing I want to think about is, are you an emerging artist? This is going to be a different conversation if you're already mid-career or established. But if you're an emerging artist, you may find yourself, selling a painting that you spent 12 hours on and you sold it for $25. You do the math. Is that sustainable? At what, maybe $2 an hour?
Not exactly.
Not if you live in the US of A. Definitely no. Definitely no. Not sustainable at all. But when you start, that's something that you may do, right? Think of it this way too. It may seem like, okay, but nobody's going to give me $100 for this thing, right? Or nobody's going to give me $1,000 for this thing. That's okay. At first, you may be a little slower as you learn. Again, this is more for the emerging artists in our audience, but as you go over time and you kind of evolve your skills and you kind of learn more and get your practice in, you will get a little bit faster. I will say too, along those same lines, underpriced at $25 is still better than free. You don't want to set the terrible expectations, especially with family and friends, that you will make stuff for free, because once you give it for free, they may think it's free forever. Even if your paintings are now in the thousands of dollars, they'll still want free. So never let it go for free if you can help it, even if you get a little bit of money to at least cover your materials, please. But definitely know that this will change over time and your prices will adjust over time as well. So based on different milestones, perhaps constructive feedback that you receive, please keep this with a grain of salt as you receive it. But essentially, you will change these prices. So don't be afraid. If you're starting out, you may start a little bit on the quote unquote more affordable side of things. Please, not free. But you can adjust this over time for sure.
Exactly. And kind of zooming out, it can be an emotional process pricing your artwork, right? Especially if we as artists always have elements of self-doubt or questioning, what is my artwork worth? How do I calculate that? But really zooming out and asking yourself, what do you want to be known for or perceived as with your pricing? So do you want to be perceived as potentially a cheap artist? And in the example that Adriana just mentioned, making less than minimum wage starting off. Do you want to be seen as having your pricing that's fair? So balancing between that time and skill set that you currently have, or maybe being perceived as a bit overpriced, anywhere from 5 to 10 times the price of the comparable work in your area. And with the asterisk of that saying, and this whole conversation of every area is different, every type of artist is different, every skill set is different and ranging. And so that's why it can be very difficult to price your work as an artist, because it's so subjective, right? Art is subjective, where people place value, which is why we're here today. But thinking about your pricing, do you perceive them as on the cheaper side, on a fair balance side because of your time and skill, or overpriced is one good way of zooming out and looking at it?
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And the thing with pricing, there's the perception value paradox, right? So pricing and perceived values are two different elements that are connected by what we can think of as a psychological bridge. So there's a link between that numeric price tag with subjective perceptions and societal constructs you might not be aware of necessarily. So the tricky thing is pricing is going to communicate messages about your artwork's quality, perhaps the rarity or the level of investment needed to own it. And as the artist, you're going to play a pivotal role in shaping what this connection is, right? Thinking about how the artist or the art, I should say, and the pricing is perceived. So if you're going with your artwork is readily available in malls, it's everywhere. I'm going Thomas Kincaid for a second, right? That's going to bring a different picture in your head than if we said a Picasso in an exhibition or a Bob Ross. Thank you, Bob Ross. We love you. Rest in peace. Uh, a Bob Ross level of artwork versus if you were to say a Basquiat, which once again, like those are extreme examples, but there is a psychological link between how people see the pricing of one versus the other, for sure.
Absolutely. And the perceived value is shaped by our individual interpretations and cultural influences attributed to an artwork's price, right? So a higher pricing can evoke those notions of exclusivity and high craftsmanship, enhancing the perceived value of the piece, while underpricing of a piece may cast some doubt on the artwork's legitimacy, on the artist's confidence. And if you are a collector looking for the work, you may say, is this worth even investing in as a collector? Because you feel the doubt of the artist through the pricing. But you really want to strike that balance to ensure that it's accessible to many people while also maintaining the artwork's deserved esteem and level to where you are in your creative career today.
Yeah, and as I talk to other artists and we've both done this, we'll give you guys a real quick example. Taking artwork, of course, is subjective, and the pricing and the value of it is subjective. But to give you an example, think of cars. I always like to say Lexus versus Toyota, right? Like, think of the car commercials and the way that a high end car will do its marketing versus a more economic car. There is a distinct like difference in how they show. Like that more expensive car may show they may zoom in on the lines, the flowy organic lines of the side of the car, and then like now there's like this spa situation by the ocean, whatever, versus like the more value car may show like family at a picnic, at the state fair. You know what I mean? Like it's very different, the kinds of let's just call them pricing levels or pricing tiers or economic strata, if you will, that they're going after. The same thing happens with our art, whether we want it or not. It's just kind of built in into our, for better or worse, capitalist society. And with this, some of the things we want to share with you are some of the factors that can influence pricing perception, because not all of this is going to be in your control. Like some of these, like for example, the psychological and behavioral factors are things that even that collector, art enthusiast, potential buyer may not be aware of, but you as the artist, it would really, really be helpful if you kept some of these in mind. So the first one on the list is perception of scarcity, right? If you are offering your art where there's like a sense of urgency, maybe you do timed collection releases several times a year, perhaps on your website or in person, you have available artwork, but you also have artwork that has sold on it or reserved. For some buyers, that actually gives them an emotional response where they're like, ooh, I need to buy it before it runs out, right? Especially if your main focus is original work. That is literally just one of any
Mhm.
of there's no more. There's no more. Reproductions are a little bit different, but if you're doing originals, they may feel that, right? There's also emotional resonance. So that artwork, is it bringing them a happy place? Thinking of them of a happy place or a memory. This is why it's so important. We talk about it in other episodes. You want to bring in your storytelling, which will help them make that connection, but you may not be aware of what those emotional responses are when they see the artwork. Like, you don't know. A lot of times, your viewers' response to your artwork has to do more about them than what you actually made. Literally, they're looking at it through their lens, through their experience, through their taste, and we don't know what that looks like, right? And then the other one is going to be social influence and validation. Now, this can be a little tricky because regardless of how you present yourself, you don't know what that potential collector has seen or read about you before they come to you. So they may have looked up or consumed, if you will, curator comments. They may have read something written by an art critic. Maybe you had a celebrity collector, maybe you had an NBA star, buy one of your pieces and share it on social media. Testimonials, which you can definitely collect those. Maybe you had exhibitions in prestigious, I can't say that word, prestigious venues that they have seen your work at, and they're going to form in their mind an idea of what that value might be and whether the pricing is in alignment based on where they've seen your work and how they've seen other people talk about your work or share about your work, which again, some of it is within your control, but a lot of it, what they're putting together as they come to the table to you, you don't know. You don't know that collage of influences that they're coming with. And then the other thing that they may be thinking about, and not necessarily, right off the bat consciously, they may be evaluating your artwork in terms of investment potential. So whether they're thinking of you like having your artwork in a secondary market, is it going to go up in value 10 years from now and they can sell that painting you originally made for a long time, which we're not going to discuss royalties at this time. That would be its own episode and whether we should receive them. Maybe you had a big career milestone. Maybe you have blue chip gallery representation, whatever that may look like. Once again, they're coming to the table with those things. Do they feel like it's rare? Are they having a positive emotional response? Hopefully positive. What do they perceive in terms of like, society, right? And validation, and do they think it's a good investment or not? So all those things come into play for sure.
Exactly. And there's other factors too that contribute to the way a potential collector may perceive your pricing, right? With the materials that you use. Oil paintings and marble sculptures may be perceived as more valuable than their counterparts of acrylic paints or wood, or a fine line sketch on paper is maybe seen as less than an oil painting. Also, size and perceived difficulty to produce. So, a large scale painting versus small scale, photorealistic versus hyper abstracted. These are all things that play with your perception of, oh, well, did this take them 48 hours or 4 hours? Of course, they have no way of knowing, and time doesn't always equate to value, but the perception of value can sometimes factor in. The artist's reputation, as you touched on, Adriana, the museum shows that you've had in the past, gallery representation, press and media releases, large following on social media or on your newsletter. There's larger brand and perception of you and your work, how it's marketed, how it's messaged. That also greatly influences how people perceive you, as well as those market trends. So for artists that have already reached maybe a mastery in a specific area, that's seen and sought after as valuable versus maybe someone who is more emerging or categorizes themselves as emerging.
Yeah, and a special note to add about that last one, if what's trendy is portraits, but you're a landscape painter, when that trend comes on, they're not looking at the landscape painter that switched to portraits to capitalize on the trend. They're looking at the portrait painter that's been doing this for a while. So that's what, expanding on what Jackie said about having the expertise, it's not about jumping the train, because by the time you jump into that train's gone. That trend train has already gone. And then other things to think about are the idea of accessibility versus value, right? So when you're thinking of artists that are trying to price themselves accessibly, they might be thinking of things like, hey, if I'm at a price that can cater to a wider audience, some of the benefits would include, you know, having more inclusivity, having a broader reach, a lot more people can afford it, having a more diverse base of art enthusiasts. So, to give a quick example, if you are on the higher end of the market, you know, that 20-year-old student, college student is not probably not going to be able to afford your painting, right? Like it's in terms of ages and in terms of cultural and ethnic strata, all the things, right? As well as like different tastes in people. And then think of it too as if you're, you know, focusing on accessibility, you may be giving an entry point to folks that are just starting to collect their art. It's the same thing, you know, that college student example. It's their first time, you know, creating their first art collection. If your lowest price work is $700, I don't know many students, period, or many people under 25. They exist, of course, but I don't know many people in their 20s that can afford a $700 original painting, right? You know, maybe they can afford print, but a painting might be outside of their purview. So,
Yeah, and that has to do with, I mean, value perception too. So making sure that you have pricing that is in line with the quality and the effort and the artistic significance for where you are in your creative career too. So the artist's dedication, skill, and creative input for the pieces that they're currently making sure that your value is being upheld by your current collectors and by your future collectors so that your pricing has a place to grow and expand as you grow and expand. But up next, we're going to talk about some practical tips on pricing. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the Level Up Artists Business Community. This ever-evolving membership values community over competition and growing connections with fellow creatives who share the same goals and challenges as you.
Life as a modern artist can be both exciting and overwhelming. Art school or self-taught, emerging or seasoned professional, there's a lot of information out there, but what do working artists actually need?
Other industries have continuing education programs for their professionals to sharpen up their skills and stay up to date with the systems, technology, and tools needed to succeed. And we believe that artists should too.
We've spent countless hours of trial and error weeding through tons of information to find the gold and creating sustainable systems that actually work so you don't have to waste your time going down endless rabbit holes.
We are passionate about exchanging ideas and sharing resources with fellow career-minded artists about the business side of art. From artist documents and exhibition prep to templates and tools to help you work faster and smarter, our course modules cover everything from social media to technology and sustainable studio practices too.
Ready to get started? Head on over to levelupartisthub.com to learn more, get immediate access, and level up your creative career today.
welcome back, everybody. So, adjusting pricing in your art, you know, something to note. This is an ever evolving process, but we want to go over some tips and considerations when looking at your current pricing. If you're already selling your work, if you're already having some doubts as whether it's cheap, fair, or overpriced, you know, here's some things to think about. The first one may seem kind of obvious, not necessarily obvious, and also kind of hard to do, especially in the beginning, is you have to do your research, right? You want to look at trends, pricing norms, demand for artworks in that specific artist niche or genre. Like if narrative portraiture work is all the rage, perhaps it's going to be priced a little bit higher than it was 5, 10 years ago. It doesn't mean you should price just to try to catch up with it, but it's important to understand where are you coming in relation to other existing artists, contemporary specifically, at similar levels as what you are. Like, don't look at a Shepherd Fairy, please, if you're just starting out. Like, we don't even want to talk about how much their artwork is, right? Like, it's going to be all the way up there. Try to look at artists that are similar to you in terms of what niche they're going into, but also in terms of experience. Someone a couple of years ahead of you would still give you a good idea, but someone that's been doing this for 20 years more than you have, that's not that's not helpful, guys. That's not helpful. Also, as part of your research, try to look into different pricing tiers and perhaps even limited editions. So are you going to have some smaller works on paper that are a little more accessible, Some works on canvas, are you going to do prints and like different types of reproductions? And also think of how that pricing strategy is going to tie in with your marketing strategy. It's going to be very different if you're going for the art for all type of mindset, which again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with like these different strategies we're talking about, where you're like, my cheapest piece of work is $4 for, I don't know, a bookmark, a hand painted bookmark. I don't know, I'm making this up for a sec. As opposed to saying my lowest piece of art is $700 for a piece on canvas, right? So just try to think of, if you're the more accessible one, that's also going to determine how you present yourself on social media, how you present yourself through newsletters, how you present yourself in person, what kind of art fairs and opportunities you would go to. The $4 person and the $700 person are going to go to different events. They're probably going to show in different venues. One is not better than the other, but you do want to think about how that ties in with how you want people to perceive you and how you're going to make money to pay your bills. So, yeah.
Exactly. And if you're ever worried about you're not sure where you fit in that range, then definitely seek expert advice. There's so many podcasts, books, art business courses out there, especially if you were to have a virtual mentor, officially or unofficially. There are many virtual mentors that don't know that they're virtual mentors of mine through podcasts like the one that you guys are listening to, that I loved listening to, that really helped wrap my mind around that with pricing. And with that, it also helps inform, they may have insight and experience on the current market conditions and current buyer behaviors in our industry based on larger economics that are ever evolving and changing, right? If there's just a huge trend towards a specific style of art, or if just across the board, maybe people are being a bit more conservative with their larger purchases in the art world. Those are insights that you can't necessarily find by just asking your friends and art neighbors, but those are things that you trust the research of other artists that are already researching it. Also, if you do have connections to art professionals, gallery owners, curators, or other experienced artists, that would be a great connection to have. Of course, not everyone has those direct personal relationships with them, but if you are established in your career, maybe represented at a gallery or have had a group exhibition or two with the gallery, that could be something that you kind of tap them on the shoulder and ask, hey, I would love to talk to you about this, or get your feedback if you've worked with them before in the past.
Yep. And don't be surprised too. Some of the answers you may get sometimes when you ask that kind of question is, it's up to you. I know that's not always helpful, or they'll say like, follow your gut feeling and things like that, which that is to be respected, follow your intuition as well. Also, they may say something extreme. You're too cheap or you're too expensive. As always, please take these things with grain of salt, but it's always helpful to almost like crowdsource this extra information from other sources, and then you make your own evaluation.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, of
Yeah.
understanding where if you're asking someone for advice, understanding what perspective they're coming from.
Mhm.
So let's say if you're asking a high-end gallery who their minimum pieces are $3,000, they might not necessarily understand the nuances of pricing for work in between $100 and $1,000, or different pricing tiers other than their own. They may just say, oh yeah, we would represent this in the gallery, sell it for $8,000, which would be wonderful, or vice versa, So understanding the expertise of the expert that you're asking, because that then informs the type of answer they're going to give you. And then you can kind of process and take with it what you want.
Yep. And with that too, know that these artists, these influencers, whatever, they don't owe you anything. So they may just say no. And that is okay. Move on. There's plenty of people like us through this podcast and other artist podcasts that are happy to share this information. So don't be discouraged. Another thing to consider is you got to value yourself. Let's brass tacks. You got to value yourself. You got to recognize and think about the intrinsic and extrinsic value of the art you're making, your creative effort, the skill that you're, investing your education in to learn? Your materials, how do you feel about it emotionally? Put it this way, if you're underpricing, that can lead to financial strain. It can hinder your ability to invest in your own artistic growth and taking classes and getting better materials to create your artwork, or even spending the time to make it. Because you're like, well, I can only get $20 for this, so why would I bother, right? And then on the other hand, of course, overpricing might lead to a lack of sales and perhaps even missed opportunities to showcase your work. If you're like, oh, I'm a total beginner and I just made this thing the size of a sheet of paper and it took me 10 minutes, maybe you're a genius, but 99.9999% of everybody can't pull this off. Let's just be real. I made this thing. It took me 10 minutes on a sheet of paper using craft paint, and I'm going to sell it for $5,000. If nobody knows who you are and you just got started, maybe start a little lower than that, right? Like, yes, we're here. We're going to cheer you on and value yourself, but also be really honest about where you are in your career and where your skill level is. You don't want to go too far under, but you don't want to go too far over either.
Yeah, and that's one of the terrifying but also exciting parts of being an artist is that you are in control. So kind of zooming out a little bit, looking at this on a larger scale, asking yourself, okay, who am I as an artist and where do I want my value to lie, right? Who is my ideal target base in terms of what they can afford from a high end, from a middle standpoint, and maybe from a more affordable standpoint? And am I going to offer pieces in all of those price points or lean into just one? Because the way you and your work are valued really is set by you and how you price your work. And then, as we talked about earlier, the ripple effect of how you market your work, what types of calls you go for, you are in control of that. And so it can be really hard to change. Let's say if you start with having super affordable artwork, and by that, I mean from the $5 to maybe $200 range. And that's all of your body of work, maybe even lots of things for free. And then overnight saying, well, this painting that you used to buy for $100 a month ago, now that's $6,000. That's a very rigid jump. But if you're wanting to, as your work increases, change prices, understanding you determine that starting point as you are emerging artists and setting those prices. And if you are an established artist and you realize maybe through this conversation or through research that your prices aren't where they need to be, then you can slowly work up to that. But at least now you know the level in which you want to be hitting.
Absolutely. And no, there is no art pricing police coming after you if you're
Right.
over and under. But like we said, it might affect the way people perceive you and the value of your artwork. Not that everybody else's opinion matters that much, honestly, but if you're going to sell your work to make a living, it's a business decision. You got to think about this for sure. So, as we wrap up, some final thoughts. This is something I hear a lot. A lot of artists express concerns, frustration, resentment, even towards galleries or other institutions for quote unquote taking slash stealing, part of their income through a commission, which a lot of times can be often around 50%. And something I want y'all to kind of think about is your artwork pricing should include your sales and marketing effort and your expenses, so that when you have a gallery or third party sell on your behalf, you're basically paying them to take over some of that work for you, right? So you want to take, in order to know if you're ready for this, take your prices, your current prices, and cut them in half. Is it time to make an adjustments? And the reason I'm saying this is if you are paying them 50% to do the marketing, to find, the buyers, to do the sales conversation, to do the transactions, to do the follow-ups, to do the shipping, to put the stuff together in a presentation, to mail to their mailing list and get all these people in one room to see your stuff, right? If you're doing that for yourself too, why wouldn't you pay that to yourself as well, right? Like part of it should be what you're doing for the work itself. Part of it should be for the effort you're putting in into finding the right person the right home, if you will, the right buyer or collector for your work. So don't sell yourself short. You have to pay yourself for both of those things, the business side and the work itself. So when you think of a gallery, if they're doing a good job, right, which of course that's the goal, you're just delegating some of that work. So they're not quote unquote taking anything. I mean, if they're not great, that's a different story. But if they're working as galleries are designed to work, that's all you're doing. You're paying them for a service. This is why we stress a lot. It's all a business partnership. It has to work. But yeah, that's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, another thing to think about too is understanding that by setting your prices, that is not saying that they are set at that price forever, but it is a lot easier to increase your prices than maybe start super high and having to go backwards. Because, of course, if you were to sell pieces at a high price and then your repeat collector comes to your website or your social media or your studio and see, well, this is about the same style of piece at the same scale, but it's $400 less than what I bought it for. That doesn't always go over so well. So it's much better to maybe shy on the lower side and then increase as you go. But you have to remember to increase them as you go. So set calendar reminders, maybe every quarter, every 6 months, at minimum every year, to check back in on your prices. Because when you think about it, the cost of living increases every year. All industries change their pricing, or at least look at their pricing and evaluate the profitability every single year. And so that affects the prices of materials that we as artists use, the cost of them. And as you get more skilled as an artist, your value will go up as well. And so really increasing your prices anywhere from 10 to 15% is pretty standard. And so remembering to do that rather than having a set price and this is it forever, but really looking at whether every 6 months, every year, does this price still accurately reflect who I am, the work that I'm making now, and how the value is perceived?
Yep.
It's super important.
Absolutely. And a slight exception to that rule too of the 10 to 15% is if you are working with a gallery, sometimes that gallery will help with the pricing and might say, you need to adjust this a little bit more. You just had a big exhibition at blah, blah, blah museum that has brought up your value. You need to go up. You need to go up on this. So that does tie back to seek expert advice. If it's a business partner you're working with, leverage their expertise. You still have final word, of course. And you decide if that relationship is good for you. And also if the audience that you have been catering to all this time is in alignment, just like Jackie said, if you're, racing that price quite steeply overnight, yeah, some of those collectors might be like, I just bought a 36 by 36 in training from you for $900. And overnight, it either goes way down and it's $500. What happened? Are you running a sale? Are you moving studios? Like, what's going on? Are you quitting? Like, what's happening? Or the opposite, it's $6,000. Hold up, does that mean the painting I own now is worth all that much? Like, that can lead to confusion. Or did I get it at a great deal? Maybe that's great, but also I don't know how I feel about it. Like, essentially, the exception is if you're working with a more experienced business partner, they might make a little bit of a bigger adjustment, but otherwise, yeah, a little bit at a time. That's fine, unless you're hitting big milestones, which will trigger other increases for sure. But that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes and links to our other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at MART across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram.
Also, make sure you visit Level Up Artist Hub so that you can join our business community, get immediate access to templates, resources, and art business course modules to level up your creative career.
Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.